I'm Brad Wible from Science Magazine, a senior editor in the commentary and opinion pages, where I dabble in some science policy and education issues. Thanks for being here. As I said during the last Q&A, my big disclaimer is I don't have any formal legal training, and so I'm apt to misspeak. So please don't sue me. So while we're here to discuss implications of a 30-year-old landmark case that impacts how technical evidence is handled in court, I wanted to shout out to a month-old case that, from what I understand, many people are suggesting is another landmark case that highlights a lot of what we seem to be talking about today. And so many of you may have read about Held versus State of Montana, decided in mid-August, which concluded that the state is violating the rights of young people with policies that prohibit the state from considering climate change effects when it reviews fossil fuel projects. And so that's said to have established climate change litigation as a valid legal avenue for addressing environmental concerns. And I know that's something that excites a lot of us. And the centerpiece in that case was expertise and evidence from climate science, drawing upon well-organized mountains of historical data, climate models, and statistical techniques to estimate contribution of human activity to climate change phenomena. So most other speakers during this conference are focusing on such scientific evidence and expertise through the lens of courts and judges and attorneys and Dalbert. Our panel is unique in that we were asked to focus farther upstream, long before the courts are involved, on how the scientific community converges on what it considers to be valid scientific evidence and expertise in the first place. And so to understand that, we need to understand that counter to what far too many people learn in school, science is not a static body of facts, but a dynamic social process mediated by shared practices and norms. It's iterative, continually updating and overwriting itself, refining and refuting established findings and methods and experts who champion them, and developing and testing new methods from little-known scholars. Science speaks the language of uncertainty and probability. It's wonderfully and painfully human and messy. But over time, a number of practices have consistently helped keep the enterprise on track and moving forward, and chief among those have been peer review and publication. But even these practices are imperfect, and the landscape is changing. More and more disciplines are posting their unpeer-reviewed, unpublished work on publicly available repositories, for example, where they can attract attention and stimulate dialogue, but potentially also contribute to hype or misinformation. Changes in the business of scientific publishing are driving what some fear could become a race to the bottom, where no research paper, no matter how flawed, is unpublishable because it represents a unit of revenue. Professional incentives that many researchers face can drive them to focus on flashy emerging topics, rather than boring but essential documentation of more established phenomena. It may even drive some PIs to cut corners or even resort to fraud. And there are many other challenges that we could touch on during discussion that are unfolding in parallel. So all the panelists here can speak to these issues from their experiences. Scientists as authors of scientific papers, as peer reviewers, and as journal editors. So we're not going to explicitly anchor our discussion around Dalbert. There's been enough of that already, and there's more to come. So we're going to just focus on how scientists do science. But hopefully we'll hit on issues of validity, methodology, credibility in ways that are useful. So, starting at the far end of the stage, Dr. Adriana Bankston, who is a senior fellow for science policy at the Federation of American Scientists, and she's also a strategic advisor and immediate past CEO and managing publisher of the Journal of Science, Policy, and Governance. All of them have much more elaborate and impressive resumes that you can read online, but in the interest of time, we'll just cut to the chase. Michael Sachs, who's joining us again for the second panel in a row, is the Regents Professor at the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law at Arizona State University and former editor of the journals Jurimetrics and Law and Human Behavior. And finally, on the left here is Jake Yeston, who's editor for research for physical sciences, also at Science Magazine. So I'm going to sit down now and get started with a few questions, but this isn't meant to be just more of a free-flowing conversation. So I just sprung this on them about 7 minutes ago, and so we're going to see how it goes. And so I think a key question that came up when having preparatory talks with the organizers was, in a court setting, how do we know to have confidence in one expert and one method and one body of facts versus another, particularly whether it's a matter of a dynamic personality, senior personality versus a new or emerging scholar, or whether it's a well-established canonical finding versus a game-changing, paradigm shift. And so all of our disciplines that we work in have seen this time and time again. And so we just wanted to sit back and think, when you get caught in the middle of these moments, and the ground is shifting, it can be unsettling at first. But eventually, over time, the cogs in the machine work itself out, and we come to have some confidence in the new way of thinking and the new way of doing things. But beyond just saying, well, you know what, when you see it, or it's a gut instinct, I think we could all hopefully say there's something a little bit more systematic about how those things happen and how confidence in a new way of thinking emerges. So. I'll just leave it at that, and if anyone wants to jump in here and say, whether it's your experience as publishing research or just as a consumer and a reader of research or editing a journal, what are the hallmarks? What do the non-scientist communities need to know about what needs to happen in order for there to be confidence in these new paradigms?
Yeah, I can start. So thanks for the invitation. I think definitely credibility. So I think a lot of folks here come from science, and the folks who are in your field, and seek out those folks that you're likely to read their publications. I think from my perspective, also timeliness. So if we think about COVID and when all that research came out and folks sort of jumped at, and that's a good question to think about, whether, how much of that was credible or just sort of the timeliness of it, and that a lot of publications were coming out on the topic. I think the way I look at this too is, and I come from a research background, but more in the science policy field. So a lot of that goes through sort of relationship building, and if someone, nominates someone and says this person is an expert, right? So you have that sort of referral network too that I think could make a difference when you're speaking to folks that those names are known, or someone else picks those folks. There was a discussion on the question of trust, actually, at a science policy boot camp I went in the summer, and a lot of that came down to commonalities and how folks identify with the speakers, right? Whether it's like the same race or someone that's from your hometown, that sort of thing. So I think those commonalities can also impact how you trust someone. And then finally, I would say to the question of the shift, I personally tend to gravitate towards people that kind of change the status quo and do things that are new and interesting and not what's always been done. So that's something that might attract me to actually listen to that person if they're proposing something really different from the status quo.
In the 5 minutes since Brad warned us that this question was coming, I've been trying to think from my own field, which is experimental social psychology, applied, well, my version of it is interacting with law. And I can't think of a kind of a lightning bolt change, and I think maybe any paradigm shift doesn't, except maybe cosmology. But we can get to that later. When you are in the stream, you don't know where the change takes place, perhaps. That I'm sure over the years in my field, the journal comes out periodically, and there are new articles, and they're learning new things. So is that just the further development of normal science, or is it when, I think you can only tell there's been a big paradigm shift when you look back. And I once, on 2 occasions, I've tried to push paradigm shifts. Back many years ago when I was the editor of Law and Human Behavior, I was getting a little tired of seeing article after article after article focused on eyewitness identification. How much more do we need to know about eyewitness identification? And the other big area was actually one that I participated in, which is studies of jury decision-making. And so I took it upon myself as editor to write an editorial in which I told the readers and the contributors, you know, there's a lot more going on in the law that might benefit from some psychological research than eyewitnesses and juries. And I listed a whole lot of things in the law that people might want to get interested in. And first, I got a fair amount of pushback that, don't tell us what to do research on. And one of the arguments made, and I think I have come to believe it, in eyewitness, there is so much that was learned about eyewitness identification, an area that I have had zero involvement in, but they learned so much and figured out how to do so much to test it, to improve it, and one of the arguments was someone who criticized my editorial said, a lot of researchers need to work on something a lot, coming at it from their different perspectives and replicating and testing the limits of things, that you can't tell people just move on to something else because you're getting bored with these articles. And I think this person was right. I think they accomplished a lot in a small area. So I think one of the lessons might be that when anything new comes along, well, you certainly don't want to put too much faith in it too quickly. Wait a while, see what develops, make sure it's a real effect. We now have a lot of failures to replicate problems going on. So make sure it's real, and then wait for researchers to test the limits of the phenomenon, interactions with other things, and learn science. I think scientific learning is a slow, step-by-step, unpredictable process.
All right. I sort of want to make two slightly different but related points, but the common theme is that I think there are different kinds of uncertainties in scientific publishing and in, for lack of a better word, forensics testimony. And I think part of the difficulty is that the source of validity is different in each case. And so I don't personally have legal experience, but I read about it. And I think that when you are dealing with an expert witness, the question is that person credible? Do the people believe that person? Do they believe that her or his analysis was valid? And generally speaking, how that's working is that that person is trying to convince people who don't have expertise in the relevant domain. And so they will say things like, oh, I have so and so many years of experience, or, I studied for a long time to do exactly this kind of analysis, right? That's not generally how we judge the validity of a scientific paper. And so I think there are sort of pros and cons to each model, but I think it's important to keep in mind that when there is an error, when, for instance, an expert witness makes a mistake, there's very often not a good way of ascertaining that mistake was made, right? Except in a case where, for instance, you get DNA evidence later and you regard that that's more valid than whatever contrary evidence the expert was testifying about. You could be in a situation where, the expert says, for instance, the bullet matches the gun, the person goes to jail, and you can't then do that experiment again, right? You can't say, okay, well, let's have another bullet and another gun and another expert and see if the person will go to jail the second time, right? And so you're sort of stuck in this binary situation where you're relying on this expert. In scientific research, as far as publication goes, you're often in a position where you can try to replicate the data, and you can try to do the experiment again and try to get, either bolster the original outcome or learn something new about it that can then inform the way that you do experiments going forward. And personally, I think it's really essential to do more of that in the forensics sphere, right? To try to move more to a paradigm where, rather than relying on the apparent expertise of whoever's testifying, there is a more straightforward paradigm of informing even lay people what the underlying statistical validity of the technique really is. How much has been studied, how much has been discovered recently to bolster whatever claim the expert is arguing.
Thanks. I'm going to sort of fold my next two questions here together, and that is, I don't know how judges or juries or lawyers or attorneys think about peer review. I can imagine it's probably not as nuanced as how people who live it and breathe it as scientists do. And so, and that could be for better or that could be for worse. So I'll just ask any of you, in your experience, are there any particular flaws or features or bugs of the system that are like breathing to practicing scientists and publishing authors, but maybe that nuance is lost when it gets brought into a courtroom by people who aren't, sort of practicing scientists? Anyone have any thoughts? Please, someone have thoughts.
It's very scientific. But now, unfortunately, playing with this thing made me forget what I was going to say. All right.
Autobiographical memory error.
It'll come back to me.
I think there's no doubt that reviewers can also get stuck in a paradigm. And I think, as I said, one of the hallmarks of good science is people being open to new results that might contradict what they saw before. And certainly it's the case that you need open-minded reviewers for that purpose. And you can send a paper to a reviewer and they'll say, oh, I don't believe it, because it contradicts what I learned in school, so it's probably wrong, right? And being open to seeing new data that might change your mind, obviously is essential, but, human beings are involved. And so, yeah, there's always personalities, there's always people who are going to, revert to what they're used to. And that's one of the biggest challenges in my job, right? Because a lot of what Science Magazine asks for is, paradigm breaking research. And, a lot of times you need to find people who are open to that and who are not going to look at it and say, again, just from the first few lines, I doubt it. I'm going to go into this so skeptical that I'm not even really going to try to think about it. So, yeah, I think that's finding people who are both rigorous and open-minded is, essential to the task.
Peer review may be overstated, overplayed. Daubert talks about peer review. Peer review is another consideration, as if peer review is peer review is peer review. There are studies that I don't know a lot of, but I know enough of them to know there are studies of the journal selection and peer review process. And one thing that is probably noticeable to editors who get a lot of peer reviews to look at, what these studies have confirmed is that there's quite a range in the quality of the peer reviews, in the insightfulness of the reviewers, in the helpfulness of the reviewers. And even in Daubert, where it talks about peer review, I don't think that was the main point that Blackman was making. Because even in that paragraph on peer review, he's talking about that as an assist to the judge in doing what Blackman envisioned the judge's main job being, which was ascertain the validity of the knowledge that underlies the proposed testimony. And peer review is a help. But then, and I think it's even consistent with this notion, that the peer review that occurs after publication is more important than the peer review that took place before publication. Before publication, it's a small number of people. Some journals use fewer, some use more, but it's a small number of people. After publication, the entire field, the entire world can read it, comment on it, write articles attacking it, do another study that challenges some of the claims. And I think, and one thing I want to say, we had some online discussion before we met, and someone in that discussion, or some emails exchanged, said, peer review, where did peer review come from anyway? So I did a little quick research on it, and I learned that the first journal ever to engage in peer review was in 1665, the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Academy. Now think about this. Francis Bacon was born 100 years before that. So Francis Bacon in his life never saw a peer-reviewed article. And peer review as we know it, where, except for law journals, pretty much every journal has peer reviewers. This did not really, even though the first journal to do it did it in 1665, it really didn't start until the 1940s. It's a post-World War II phenomenon. And before there was peer review, before there were journals, there were, did I say in 1665 the Philosophical Transactions was the first to do peer review? No, that was the first journal. So Francis Bacon never saw a journal, much less a peer-reviewed journal. Researchers, scholars would write up what they had and they'd circulate it among their colleagues and their friends, or they'd go to conferences and present it. But it didn't get put into a journal and published until 1665. The first journal ever to do a peer review was in the 1700s. But think about all of that passing around things without editors, without peer reviewers. That is happening again today, thanks to the internet, thanks to websites where you can post your work in advance of formal publication. Now, some journals are very persnickety and they embargo everything because they don't want anybody to know about it until they publish it. But it could be that peer review will become obsolete because it's so easy to get your work out there, and before it gets formally published, other people will already be trying to replicate it or commenting on it. So it could be we will come full circle. And I don't know what that world will look like, but it will probably look like it looked in the 1600s.
Well, to add to that, and I'm glad I went after you because I asked a question about the peer review history. Because nowadays I think there's a lot of different models, and having run a peer-reviewed journal for the past 2 years and having published all kinds of things in research, some that were peer-reviewed, some were not, I think what you're saying makes a lot of sense in thinking about the value of peer review and whether that adds validity and why that is or not, because there's a lot of different kinds of publications these days, and I pride myself for having run a peer-reviewed journal, but there are other versions, and as you said, the peer review that happens either behind closed doors before it gets published or after. So I think we talked about this in the prep call too. Journals like F1000 Research, where all their reviews are post-publication, and I've participated in that too. And I think that brings up the question of transparent peer review and this iteration of science where you publish one version, another version gets published, and they do take into account the peer review and they publish another version, and I published there too, versus the sort of preprint world side of things, which I think is valuable when you think about iterating scientific work and publishing better versions based on feedback from the community, which then leads to another version and so on. So I think we're in a different world now than we were even when I was in grad school. And I think in the context of courts and law, and we discussed this in the call too, which I thought was really eye-opening, how science is iterative, and you, as already came up, that you already have a lot of opportunity to replicate and iterate and republish and publish another version, but in the court, you're sort of, I need the answer now, so whatever's in front of you, that's what you base it on, right? So that's a good thing to consider and think about how to make that distinction too. And to what was just said before, that what did we do before peer review existed, right? And I think that brings up also other products, because peer-reviewed publications are one way to share knowledge that's been accepted for 50 years or so. But there are other ways to share knowledge that are equally valuable, whether it's preprint that leads to a better publication, or other ways to share knowledge that is not a journal article too. So just some more thoughts to add.
Thank you. I would say, and Michael, correct me if I'm wrong, I think your description of peer review and how it's changing is accurate. I thought I heard you maybe say that we're going and maybe peer review is on its way out. Maybe I misunderstood. What I would say is that peer review is still here. It's just taking different, maybe narrow journal-mediated peer review may be shifting and wobbling, but I think there's a lot of other peer review modalities ready to take its place. I guess another question, not just necessarily about peer review, but just about general credibility and integrity of science. There are a number of threats to it, but also a lot of innovations that are out there. And so I'd like the panelists to speak to some of their things that they see, either storm clouds on the horizon, but how is the community adapting to address them? And so I teed up Jake because I know he spends a lot of time with this at Science, and that is that I don't know if any of you have any little kids who are learning math in school, and my kids happen to somehow be good at getting the number, but what they're not good at is showing their work. And so you have to show your work. And in science, that is the same. And so it's no longer acceptable at Science Magazine and a lot of other magazines to say, here's my methodology, here's my results, publish it. Because then you say, well, where's your data and where's your code? Because we need to be able to make up our own minds. And so I would like Jake to talk about that. And and then you guys can fill in as well, some other innovations to sort of maintain the integrity and credibility and trust of the enterprise.
Yeah, so, one of the things about getting old is that you start to look around and realize that when you talk about what things were like when you were in grad school, people start to sort of look around like they don't believe it. But, I was in graduate school in the late 90s, which was sort of the very last sort of pre-internet generation. And when we published a paper, what we would do is we would, put a bunch of paper in a box and ship it to the journal. And that was what was called supporting data. And then the journal, maybe they put it in a file cabinet, maybe they threw it away immediately. I don't actually know. But, the idea was that if anybody ever wanted to see that, They could contact the journal and, maybe the journal would have it on microfilm, who knows. But the point was that people weren't really carefully going through that box. And the creation of the internet, and especially more recently, the innovations in cloud storage paradigms, have really introduced the possibility of storing data much more publicly for a much longer time. And so our position now, which is increasingly the position of the whole scientific publishing community, is that you should present all of the data necessary for someone trained in your discipline to repeat your experiment. And basically what that means is sort of subject to some debate field to field, but the general idea is, if you have a plot in your paper that's, a line fit through 5 points, oftentimes every one of those 5 points will have reams of data underlying it that have been averaged and processed and, perhaps had a variety of other background points subtracted. And so the idea really is don't just say, oh, well, I have 5 points and you saw them in the graph, but, here's what each of them is. Really explain what's all the information that went into creating that graph. And that way, what sometimes happens is people will go back and they'll say, oh, well, if I do the background subtraction a little bit differently, I get a slightly different answer. And then science can progress more quickly that way by people jumping off immediately from where you left things in your paper. I would say there is a sort of mixed reception to this. There are a small number of people who don't like it because they think that it restricts their advantage in publishing more papers. That, if they reveal their data, then, somebody else could use it. But as I said, they're in the minority. I think the majority of people just think it's a hassle. And what I do day in, day out when I go to visit university chemistry departments, I try to convince them that being proactive about it will be useful not just for me and for the publishing infrastructure, but for all of their future graduate students who will then have to go and look for the data because, they might be building on the experiment. And if it's already, beautifully organized and archived, then it will not only improve scientific transparency, but in all likelihood improve the productivity of that lab. And so that's hopefully where we're going.
Now that sounded like an illustration of how change in technology changed the journal publishing process. An example that interests me is how recognizing a weakness in one's field's research leads to innovations. In psychology, in economics, in biomedicine, and probably other fields, researchers started to realize that phenomena that they thought were established started to not be replicable. And if you think about, now why might that be the case? Now, leave aside pure fakery, but which exists and sometimes is caught and sometimes is not. Leave that aside. Suppose you had an idea of some phenomenon that ought to exist, and you do your study to detect it, test if it's there, demonstrate it, whatever you want to call it, and you don't get an effect. For many, 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 many years, journals were not interested in such null results. So you're not even going to waste your time sending it to a journal. So you do it again. You change your experiment a little bit. I must have done something wrong. And it doesn't work. And maybe you do this 19 times, and then finally you get an effect. Now I picked Yeah. But, so maybe it's just random happenstance, but also, whatever it is, there's an article that a journal will take a look at. And let's say that gets published. And let's say it works one time out of 20, and maybe it is just chance, or maybe it's not much of a phenomenon. It's certainly not a dependable phenomenon. But that's the phenomenon that gets published, and that then somebody writing a textbook includes it, and the word gets out. So in various fields, they started, and replication, somebody wants to replicate my study that I finally got to work. Somebody wants to replicate it, they can't replicate it. They send their failure to replicate to a journal, and the journal says, oh, who's interested in this? So the structure of the publication process may be a contributor to the problem that things were being published that weren't real, that weren't true effects, due not to anyone's nefarious conduct. So people started thinking about solutions to this problem. One solution was put together teams of people who find the phenomenon and people who don't find it, and see if they can work together to design a study that they both agree should detect it if it exists. Another innovation is registration of a study in advance. And then, if it's a well-designed study and it's been registered in advance and you get null results, it'll still get published. And that's a way to put a check on a phenomenon that is just the result of chance.
Okay. And now we're short on time, so just a couple of things to add to what was already said. I think the question of credibility and scientific integrity is complicated, but really critical. You kind of brought up a little bit the retractions that we've seen sometimes. So I wanted to make sure to bring that up because that really impacts all generations. Just imagining folks who are going to use your data 20 years from now, and graduate students that are using that data. So think broader. One of the things we talked about in the prep call too is what if you have a junior faculty who publishes something that's more innovative versus someone who is embrace the status quo, is well known in the field. Who do you trust more, and why is that? And I don't have the answer to that, but something else to consider for the audience, because I think a lot of times new investigators or newer or younger folks, their views aren't always as appreciated for a number of reasons. And then the last thing I'll say is, because the journal that I ran was Science Policy, and so in some ways I think that's similar to law, probably because it's more abstract, that it is based on evidence and research, and it's well researched when it comes to background, but then there are recommendations to what needs to happen and what we want to see change, and some of those things aren't easy to quantify and show that this is real science in some ways, because it's really an abstract concept of we want this person to do this based on our data, and that's something else to think about is technical fields versus fields that are, I think, more abstract, that are still valuable, but maybe harder to actually quantify the validity in some ways.
Thank you all so much. We have a small amount of time if anyone has any questions. Speak now, or et cetera, et cetera. All right, thanks.
Yeah, I have a question. I'm Elise Walsh, recent graduate from Johns Hopkins University in human genetics. So one question, or I guess statement that I would like you guys to talk a little bit more about is the publish or perish attitude that scientists are kind of forced to adopt. For example, when I was in graduate school, I lost my funding because the government no longer wanted to fund basic research. So that also goes to the lack of publishing of null results. If you're not getting this basic research, or you're not getting contradictions, then how are we supposed to move forward?
Yeah, I can start with this one. So I think one thing, since you didn't bring up kind of null results, I think there's a shift now to publish, failures in science and things that don't lead anywhere, because those are valuable too. To your point earlier, that some things don't have an effect, so that's a good thing to publish too. To the publish or perish, I would say, I think that's a culture change. It needs to include a lot of other things where I think it's tricky what kinds of things are valuable to move someone along the tenure track. But I think it speaks to broader issues in science that whereas publications are valuable, there are a lot of other things that make a scientist valuable person who can talk about technical issues, because those publications aren't everything you do. So that's kind of what I have to say. I think it's a broader culture thing.
I would just very quickly add that I think that's why we need to increasingly emphasize data sets. Publishing a data set is a very valuable thing to do. And I think we're increasingly trying to, improve the infrastructure for crediting data and citing data and linking to data. And, that's one way of being able to get negative results out there, or get, not even so much negative, but just, results, the significance of which is not yet clear. And then, when people go and re-examine those data, they give credit to the people who generated the data at the outset.
Joel, are we still doing questions, or is this a hard stop at you? How convenient. Great.
So I'll be very brief. I wonder if any of you can comment on whether or not there's a mechanism for the system in publication to recognize when there's been an advocacy group that has continued to bring the same non-data-based idea back again and again and again and again and again, because it sounds innovative, but it's not testable, non-falsifiable, and has no data, and becomes truth by repetition. But because of the way the publishing world works in their independent reviews, do we have any mechanisms for stopping that, particularly when it starts to be applied to courts?
If there are no data, how is it getting published?
For example, Psychological Bulletin published a paper which said, this is an innovative concept, it's a concept idea. In the paper, it says there is no data. So it doesn't look like there's a mechanism, but since we're looking at innovation, I thought I'd throw it out there.
I don't know the case in particular. I mean, I would shudder to think that publications that are trying to promote debate and discussion would only publish things that are, I mean, if it's publishing it and presenting it as a data-based factual piece, that's bad. But why wouldn't you want to publish provocative ideas so that they can be out there to be? So I'm not familiar with the case. Like, are you?
So
anyway.
I'll just give a couple more examples and we won't get into
Well, I mean, we're running out of time. We could.
But just for this particular topic, just to get your ideas going when things come to you. Developmental Psych published a similar paper by the same team of people. They refused commentaries that pointed out that they misrepresented what they said and there was no data, as did Current Directions in Science.
I can't comment on what other journals do. I mean, anyone have any familiarity here?
No, but I will just say science publishes letters. Someone ought to be able to write at least a letter that says that stuff is BS, which means bad science, and give there no data. It's a good reason.
Hi, I'm Delta Murner. I'm at the Union of Concerned Scientists. So coming at this from a scientist perspective, I guess the simplest kind of distillation of my question. I've been in the litigation space now around climate change just for about 4 years. And before I entered the litigation space, none of my science was ever challenged. I never had folks like kind of questioning it and trying to write articles that countered it. In this space, I see it a lot more. But for myself and my colleagues, I'm curious, if you see this as just a larger cultural shift that's happening, or if there's something particular for science that is informing the legal space, and then if there's other tactics outside from just kind of what the larger peer review process has for scientists who are in this space to think about as they're publishing and kind of getting counter argument which are often in these large non-peer reviewed, like pay to publish journals. So, but the courts don't always understand the difference between that and other things. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I think that, there's an element of whack-a-mole to the whole thing, right? Where, once you start deeply engaging in one particular counter-argument, they can very quickly shift to a second counter-argument. And so, in some sense, I guess I would say those are probably cases where an attorney is at an advantage relative to a scientist because, the attorney might be an especially skilled debater. And, one of the difficulties that I've found, I've dealt with that, obviously not in a legal environment, but, I've dealt with people I know who decide that they're going to be climate contrarians. Either they really are or they think it would be, enjoyable just to sort of, play that game. And, they have access to a variety of, sort of cherry-picked points. And the difficulty is that, as I said, when you start deeply engaging on one point, they will sort of say, oh, well, okay, but, what about this, right? And, I think that the hardest aspect of it is, is it a good faith conversation? Is this someone who is interested in learning more about the subject matter than they knew at the outset? Or is it someone who is just trying to trip you up, right? And, you're going to get to the end and you're going to feel like, I was trying to inform you and you were just sort of trying to zig and zag. And, as I said, unfortunately, I wish I knew what to say about sort of zigzaggers besides that, you need to be an equally skilled zigzagger. That's unfortunately the best answer I can give at the moment.
I'll just make a pitch for the freedom of speech and being a good zigzagger. If you are doing something that is relevant to a controversial issue, culturally, politically, a matter that is subject to litigation, you can count on people one way or another who view the world differently. Let me just say, they're on the other, whatever side of the issue you're on, they're on another side of it. They're going to attack your work or try to produce counter work. And partly this is all, in a way, it's good. It's part of how knowledge moves ahead. But we hope that those with the stronger data and the better theories will prevail, and that isn't always how it works. I'll just leave you with a book recommendation. There's an epidemiologist at George Washington University named David Michaels who's published a book called The Triumph of Doubt, where there's a whole industry that produces counter data. They're hired by corporate interests who need counter data to tell you there's no environmental problem, these chemicals don't hurt anybody. And anyway, so this is part of life.
Thank you, and you, and you, and you, and we're done.
Thank you.